ورحمة الله وبركاته. I'm Bashar Al-Natoor, the Global Head of Islamic Finance at Fitch Ratings. I've been asked to make this shorter by 5 minutes, and being in a rating agency, that is something that I can hopefully achieve. So if we can go to the beginning. So, I think the topic is Islamic economy in the UK, and I think that's a very broad topic. And I chose to start with zooming in on the Islamic finance and branch out towards the remaining of that. If I may, I don't know if I can move this, but I think it needs to move to the beginning. Yeah, no, this is the beginning. So when we're talking about the Islamic economy, you are talking about a lot of sectors. So you're talking about the halal industry, you are talking about halal tourism, you are talking about halal food, you are talking about various aspects of that. One of these aspects is halal Islamic finance. So Islamic finance is actually the halal form of doing Islamic finance. I'm not gonna go and talk about how is that and how is that panning out. I'll directly zoom in and say, where is it? And I think Dr. Bello explained that it is spread in more maybe than 70 countries, 15 of which is systematic important. And I think that's an important starting point. But in our rated universe, so it is really spread around various aspects. So we've just recently rated a sukuk coming from a US-based non-bank corporate. That was early this year. We've rated Hong Kong sukuk. We've looked at South Africa historically sukuk. So it's not only the Muslim countries that are dealing with that, although the Muslim countries and the OIC countries specifically, and if you zoom into the Middle East and GCC, are the prime areas where you have Islamic finance in its various branches. I'm not going to go through the details, and I'm going to cut short and talk about the UK. And when we're talking about the UK Islamic finance, I'll try to simplify it into 3 dimensions. One dimension is the international one, the second one is the regional one, and the third one is the domestic one. If I'm looking at the international one, I think the UK is really leading globally, not regionally, globally. And I think this is also mentioned by the fact that many of the international transactions, whether in sukuk or syndication, are governed by English law. That is not a simple thing. When you have the law that is governing the international side of the Islamic finance industry on the sukuk and syndication governed by a specific law, that means that this is where the parties are going to interact with. So that is a significant part that is in the UK, but it has a strong stand for the UK internationally. And I think that's a very important point because it spills out to other Islamic economy sectors. So you have the educational sector that needs to support that on the lawyer side, on the Islamic side, and in the professional side. You have local firms and expertise within the country itself that can actually service that sector. So this is where I would say, if I am to speak about the international dimension, where the UK is really strong. If I move to the regional one, and there you can zoom in on more of saying, okay, the UK and London Stock Exchange is a destination for listing of sukuk. International sukuk, the listing destination. And it competes with that on the regional aspects and even on a more global aspect. So it's one of the aspects where the UK has a strength there. But there is competition. So you have the likes of Ireland, you have the likes of DIFC, you have other also centers that are trying to compete. So if you remember, if we're talking about the English law, I think it's a strength there, and the position is, at least over the medium norm, is intact on the international side. On the regional side, if I talk about listing, there is competition. If I talk about the fund management industry, there is actually more competition. You have the likes of Luxembourg entering into the picture. You have the likes of Jersey and other countries that are also entering into that aspect. So on the regional side, there is an actual competition there. If I look at the domestic side, I would say that is the one that is weak. When I say weak, the description of weak means that there is not enough penetration to the actual desired. So it's a supply-demand. I'm looking at it from a supply-demand imbalance. And if we're talking about a Muslim population of more than 5%, 6%, or around 6%, and you're talking about the portion of the Islamic banking sector of around 1%, there is a gap there. So you look at that, why do we have a gap? And I think this is one of the things that I'll be discussing there. But if I am focusing on these areas where I am before moving, the Islamic banking industry in the UK is actually by itself is serving something beyond Islamic finance, because it's an FDI objective for the government. And most, if not all, the Islamic banks within the UK are GCC, they have GCC ownership. So that's money coming in. And many of these banks are actually managing wealth of GCC. So this is inflow. It's managing wealth, it's spilling into the residential sector. When I was coming here, I saw the Shard, and I said, okay, part of that financing is actually Islamic finance. So you're looking at an industry that is not only Islamic finance, it has other dimensions to it that is beyond Islamic finance and serving a specific purpose. But I think it's worth maybe highlighting that at the end of the day, you will look at, if you're sitting in the UK, you might be focused on the local dimension. If you're sitting outside, you'll be looking at the regional dimension. And if you are really sitting far from there and not looking at this from a practical point of view, you look at the international dimension. But in all of these dimensions, there is visibility. And that's very important. Now, that visibility and the way that it is translated varies significantly on where you're looking at. And I think here, I would like to put something I think I've heard in my previous speakers, and we will look at that. This is a very important, I would say, diagram that we put not only for the UK, but I would like to run it for the UK here since I'm here. It's looking at two dimensions that actually are the strongest driver in any ecosystem related to Islamic finance. I mean, this has been developed over years, I have to say, of work in a cross-sector, across regions. So I think the first one, I would like to always start with the supply side. And I start always with political will. Because without the political will, you will not have the ecosystem, you will not have the frameworks, you will not have the regulations, and the ability to go the extra mile to actually build Islamic finance. And when you're looking at the UK, there is an actual political will, but that political will is driven by various objectives. So why am I saying various objectives? Because if I'm looking at the Malaysian style, they actually have as part of their strategy developing Islamic finance, because they want Islamic finance to be the bigger sect. They want Islamic finance to be, they said, Islamic banks first. So when you enter any bank, conventional or Islamic in Malaysia, you will be offered first Islamic products. So they are giving incentives. That's different than the UK objectives. The UK objective is just, when you're looking at the domestic point of view, they are just trying to have a level playing field with conventional. They've done steps in that. We've seen liquidity introduction. We've seen other tools, but it's not yet there. Islamic banks are still having less product offering. They are still facing a lot of challenges in the way that they can interact even within the banking sector in a Sharia compliant way. There is improvement, but it is not yet to that extent. So we see that political will domestically. But if I zoom up and look at it from regionally and internationally, the UK is very keen to maintain its Western hub status. And they are competing with that and putting all the needed steps where the UK actually issued Sukuk twice. The UK is having a lot of discussions with the other parties to attract the investment and coming to the UK. The legal system, the educational system, the banking hubs here, all of that supports that status. So you see that when you're talking about that side of the equation, there is a stronger political will because it pans out of the status of the UK and London specifically and how it competes with regional Western hubs. And that's an important one. If I look at regulations, we've talked about them a little bit. Viability of a business profile. That is very important. I think, yes, Islamic finance is an ethical form of financing. And it is something that is based on the principle of Sharia. And there is a lot of responsible, social, and other aspects within that. But Islamic finance does not mean it needs to be a losing business. And that's a very important point. I think being Islamic does not mean that you have to lose. Being Islamic means that you can do your business with the principle, with that ethical umbrella in front of you, and still you can gain. And this is what we're actually seeing in many objectives. And that is a very important driver for also the UK local side of things. Having branch and digital banking, I'm sure there is another panel that is going to speak about fintech and that aspects of the equation. Availability of products and presence of investors. Because at the end of the day, you need money. So if you don't have investors that is willing to put his money, then you'll end up, to be honest, nowhere. and that's an important one. But it's not only the supply drivers. If I look at the demand drivers, and that's not only in the UK, but in general, public awareness comes on the top. Yes, okay, we have Islamic banks, we have products, but when you talk to people, they're not aware that there is something called Islamic finance. And that's a very important thing, and it is something that is missing significantly in the UK Muslim population, let alone the non-Muslim population. And why am I saying that? Because Islamic finance is not only targeted to Muslim population. If I look at some banks in the UAE, for example, 50% of customers is non-Muslims. It's a product competition. Of course, it is catering for Muslims, but it is an inclusive financing, not an exclusive financing. And that's a very key difference where you're looking at. I'll look at the other one is customer sensitivity to Sharia. And I'll come to that in the following slide, but I need to talk about confidence. So even if you're aware and you have Sharia sensitivity, some customers say, this is not really Sharia compliant. This does not comply with my ethics and principles. And then even when it's a Sharia compliant part of it, not being convinced that Sharia is an important one. And the last one is having competitive products. I'll go to my last slide. And here I am looking at the three segments of customers generally and in the UK. So you have the customer, the first type of customers, they will deal with Islamic finance in whatever shape or form, on whatever the quality and the product offering, because they are so sensitive to Sharia. They will only deal with Islamic finance. They're not going to deal with anything else that they consider haram. You have the second category where they'll say, okay, if the Islamic finance and Islamic banking or sukuk or whatever is going to give me a similar offering to the conventional one, I'll deal with it because that will give me a better rest of mind. But if it's not, I'll deal with the conventional one. And you have the third category. They really are not sensitive to Sharia. They will deal with Islamic finance only if it's offering them something that they want without the ethical side. And here I'm talking about Muslims, by the way. So when someone asks me what's the potential of the industry, I would say, okay, the Muslim population over Earth is between 20-25% of the global population. The percentage of Islamic finance being around 3.5, 3.3 trillion is not a representation of that segment. So the potential is really high to catch up, but you have all of these elements, including this one and the previous drivers, that will shape how the economy is going to grow. I hope I've simplified in the few time that has been given to give you a landscape of the Islamic finance industry in the UK. Thank you very much for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.